At Westbridge Military Academy, cadets mock Harold Kaine, a quiet janitor they nicknamed Colonel Broomstick, unaware of his storied past. While they strut with arrogance, Harold sweeps floors with silent dignity, his limp and precise movements hinting at battles fought long ago. Cadet Mason Trill leads the taunts, tossing trash and jeering, blind to Harold's true identity as a war hero. The instructors ignore the cruelty, but a reckoning looms. As the Academy prepares for a grand symposium, a four-star general's arrival promises to unveil Harold's hidden legacy, poised to shatter the cadets' assumptions and redefine respect. If Harold Kaine's story touched you, help us share more tales of unsung heroes. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to never miss a story. Share your own experiences in the comments. Let's honor those who serve quietly. Thank you for watching. The sharp, mocking voice of a young cadet sliced through the quiet hum of Westbridge Military Academy's polished corridors. "Hey, Colonel Broomstick," he jeered, elbowing his buddy beside him, who stifled a laugh. "Missed a spot over there, old man. Should we report you to headquarters for slacking?" The words hung in the air, followed by a chorus of snickers from the group of cadets lounging against the wall. Their polished boots gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the faded gray coveralls of the man they taunted. Harold Kaine, the Academy's janitor, didn't look up. He bent slowly, his weathered hands closing around an empty coffee cup that had been deliberately tossed to the floor, its contents staining the tiles he'd just cleaned. His face remained impassive, his movements deliberate, unhurried, as if the jeers were nothing more than background noise, as familiar to him as the hum of distant artillery once was. He swept the floor with the same steady rhythm he'd maintained for years, a rhythm born of habit, of endurance, of surviving things far uglier than the arrogance of youth. Harold's silence wasn't surrender. It was a shield, forged in battles these cadets couldn't begin to imagine. His heart, though, carried a quiet ache, not for their mockery, but for the weight of a past he'd never asked to relive. Each swipe of the broom was a meditation, a way to keep the ghosts at bay, to focus on the simplicity of clean lines and polished surfaces. But then the air in the hallway shifted. A four-star general, his presence commanding and his uniform heavy with insignia, strode past the polished podium where officers stood at attention. He didn't stop for them. Instead, he approached Harold, who was still bent over his broom, and paused. The general's hand rose in a crisp salute, his voice steady but reverent. "Sir, it's an honor to finally meet you." The words landed like a grenade, silencing the room. The cadets, their laughter still echoing in their throats, froze, their eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of shame. They had no idea who Harold Kaine truly was, but in that moment they felt the ground shift beneath them. In the minutes that followed, their understanding of respect, of sacrifice, of what it meant to serve, would be rewritten in ways they'd never forget. At Westbridge Military Academy, there are people you see every day but never truly notice. They blend into the background, part of the rhythm of the place, like the creak of old pipes or the hum of overhead lights. Harold Kaine was one such figure. To the cadets, he was just the janitor, a man in a faded gray uniform, his cap embroidered with the word "retired" in threads so worn it was barely legible. They passed him in the early mornings, their boots clicking sharply against the floors he'd buffed to a mirror shine, their minds already racing toward drills, lectures, and the pursuit of their own ambitions. Harold moved through their world like a shadow, slow and deliberate, his presence as unremarkable to them as the walls themselves. But to those who knew how to look, really look, there was something more. It was in the way his eyes lingered on the wall of honor in the main hall, a flicker of recognition, of memory, passing over his weathered face. It was in the precision of his movements, the way he aligned his broom against the wall after each use, not out of obsession, but out of a discipline so ingrained it had become part of his bones. Harold's back was slightly stooped, not just from age, but from the invisible weight of battles fought long ago, battles that had left scars both seen and unseen. His limp, barely noticeable unless you watched closely, spoke of wounds that had never fully healed, of shrapnel or strain carried for decades. While the academy buzzed with the energy of young cadets strutting in their pressed uniforms, their voices loud with confidence, Harold moved in silence. His whispers, when he spoke at all, were soft, measured, carrying a depth that went unnoticed by those too busy to listen. But that silence wasn't weakness. It was the quiet of a man who had seen too much, who had shouted orders into the chaos of war zones and now chose the peace of routine over the clamor of recognition. In his heart, he carried the weight of comrades lost, of decisions made under fire, of moments when survival hung on a thread. He didn't need to boast or bark commands like the instructors around him. His authority was in his stillness, in the way he carried himself through a world that had moved on without him. Veterans like Harold often live in the margins after their service ends. The wars they fought fade into history books, their sacrifices reduced to footnotes. They take jobs like sweeping floors, working graveyard shifts, or tending to boilers, not because they lack skill or ambition, but because there's a kind of solace in the repetition, in the quiet spaces where no one demands their rank or forces them to relive the past. For Harold, cleaning the academy's halls was more than a job. It was a way to keep moving, to keep the memories from closing in. He polished the floors with the same care he'd once given to his rifle, his hands steady despite the ache in his joints. Each motion was a small act of defiance against the chaos he'd left behind, a way to impose order on a world that had often lacked it. Yet there was something different about Harold, even among other veterans. The older instructors at the academy, those who'd been around long enough to hear whispers of his name, sensed it. They'd heard stories, fragmented, half-forgotten tales of a soldier who'd done extraordinary things, though the details were lost to time. They never asked him about it, though. To them, he was just Harold, the man who kept the academy spotless, who nodded politely and went about his work. The cadets, though, saw even less. To them, he was invisible, a fixture as unremarkable as the trash cans he emptied or the soap dispensers he refilled. If they noticed his limp, they chalked it up to old age. If they saw the way he paused to straighten a framed photo on the wall, they assumed it was just a quirk, not a moment of reverence for a life he'd once known. But beneath the gray uniform, behind the calm exterior, was a man who had lived 1,000 lives in a single lifetime. Harold's eyes, though tired, had once scanned battlefields, not just tiled hallways. His hands, now gripping a broom, had once held the weight of command, issuing orders that saved lives or ended them. Long before these cadets had learned to salute, Harold had stood in places where salutes meant survival, where respect wasn't just protocol but a lifeline. There was no plaque on the Academy's wall of honor bearing his name, no medals gleaming on his chest, no stories told in classrooms about his deeds. But Harold Kaine carried more leadership, more sacrifice, and more honor in his quiet steps than any of the cadets could yet comprehend. And as the general's salute hung in the air, the truth of who he was began to unravel, a revelation that would leave an indelible mark on those who had once dismissed him. At Westbridge Military Academy, where discipline was the cornerstone of every lesson, an undercurrent of arrogance often simmered among the young cadets, particularly those who believed their uniforms granted them wisdom beyond their years. For them, rank was a shortcut to respect, a notion that blinded them to the deeper truths of leadership. Among these cadets, one stood out, his presence commanding attention in the polished halls, Cadet Mason Trill. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a chiseled jaw and a swagger that felt meticulously practiced, Mason carried himself as if destiny had already been pinned stars to his collar. He came from a lineage of military prestige. His grandfather had steered naval ships through stormy seas. His father had soared as a decorated pilot. Mason, steeped in this legacy, walked with an air of entitlement, his eyes gleaming with the certainty that he was destined for greatness. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, he had not yet grasped the essence of true leadership: humility, restraint, and honor. These were lessons he was unprepared to learn, and in his ignorance, he found an easy target in Harold Kaine, the Academy's unassuming janitor. Harold was an older man, his frame slightly stooped, his movements deliberate as he pushed his broom down the corridors. His limp, a quiet testament to a life marked by sacrifice, went unnoticed by those who saw only his plain uniform and weathered cap marked retired. To Mason and his cohort of second-year cadets, Harold was invisible, A fixture, not a person. The torment began subtly, a creeping malice cloaked in jest, a paper cup tossed carelessly in Harold's path, a whispered jab as he swept near the mess hall. Sector 4's under attack by janitorial command, one cadet muttered, sparking snickers from the group. Mason's laughter rang loudest, a bold, performative sound that echoed with self-assured cruelty. The disrespect was rarely overt enough to draw the instructor's attention, but it was sharp enough to cut through Harold's quiet routine. Each jab, each smirk, landed like a stone, though Harold's face remained impassive, his focus fixed on the steady rhythm of his work. One crisp afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the high windows of the west corridor, Mason and his entourage trailed Harold, their boots clicking in mocking unison with his uneven gait. "Ten Hut! Colonel Broomstick incoming!" Mason called out, snapping a theatrical salute that sent the group into fits of laughter. The nickname, cruel in its dismissal, hung in the air. Harold didn't flinch. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped the broom as he continued his work, his eyes fixed on the floor. To the cadets, his silence was weakness, an invitation to push further. They mistook his restraint for indifference, convinced their taunts were harmless because they went unanswered. But Harold's silence was not born of weakness. It was a choice, a shield forged from years of enduring far greater trials than the sneers of privileged boys. The pranks escalated, each one bolder, more deliberate. One morning, just before the daily inspection, a pile of crumpled napkins and banana peels appeared outside the cadet common room, a staged mess placed squarely in Harold's path. As he knelt to clean it, his knees creaking with the effort, Mason lounged nearby, sipping coffee with a smirk that radiated smug satisfaction. "Hey, Colonel Broomstick," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Missed a spot. Should we file a complaint with headquarters?" The group erupted, their laughter bouncing off the walls. One cadet mimicked a trumpet, calling for imaginary reinforcements, while another paraded in circles with a dustpan, turning the cleanup into a parody of a military drill. Harold, methodical as ever, gathered each piece of trash without a word, his movements unhurried, his face unreadable. If the taunts stung, he gave no sign. If shame weighed on him, it didn't show in his steady hands or the quiet dignity of his posture. But Harold Kaine was no stranger to pain. His heart carried memories far heavier than the cadets could imagine. He had seen young soldiers, barely older than these boys, sob for their mothers on blood-soaked battlefields. He had carried the weight of names etched in stone, comrades lost to wars that lingered in his dreams. The silence that followed those battles wasn't empty. It was deafening, a reminder of lives cut short and promises unkept. In comparison, the jeers of Mason and his friends were mere noise, fleeting and insignificant. Yet each taunt was a reminder of the ignorance that fueled their cruelty, an ignorance that cut deeper than their words. To Mason, Harold was nothing, a faceless worker, unworthy of respect, invisible in his role. The real offense wasn't the jokes or the pranks, it was the failure to see Harold as a man, a veteran, a person who had lived through horrors these cadets couldn't fathom. No one noticed the way Harold paused each morning at the Wall of Honor, his eyes tracing the names of the fallen, his fingers brushing the edge of his cap in quiet reverence. No one remarked on the crispness of his plain uniform, pressed with care, or the weight of the word retired stitched into his cap. No one asked what that word meant, what battles it carried, what losses it concealed. The instructors, some of whom noticed the cadets' behavior, shifted uncomfortably but did nothing. It was just teasing, they told themselves, just boys being boys. They hadn't yet seen the line between harmless jest and harmful disrespect blur into something uglier. But they would, in time they would. For in places like Westbridge, built on the ideals of discipline and honor, lessons had a way of surfacing, often in the quiet moments when arrogance met its reckoning. The janitor's shadow. The cadets at Westbridge Military Academy never thought twice about mocking Harold, the janitor they dubbed Colonel Broomstick. Their taunts rang through the polished halls, sharp and careless, as they watched him shuffle past with his mop. To them, it was just a game, a way to vent the stress of drills and exams. They were young, brash, and convinced their jabs were harmless. Boys being boys, they reasoned, tossing grins at each other as Harold's silhouette faded around a corner. But what they couldn't see, what their youth blinded them to, was the cost of their cruelty. Each laugh, each sneer chipped away at something deeper. Not Harold's dignity, for he carried that like armor, but their own integrity. Leadership, the kind that defines a person, isn't forged in salutes to superiors. It's proven in the quiet moments, in how you treat those you think don't matter. And soon, in just a few days, those cadets would learn that lesson in a way that would silence their laughter forever. Harold wasn't just a janitor, though he wore the role with a quiet grace. Long before he swept Westbridge's gleaming floors, he was Colonel Harold Kaine, commander of a special operations unit so covert its missions were known only to a handful of Pentagon insiders. He didn't flaunt his past. It wasn't pinned to his chest or boasted in stories. It lived in the lines etched across his face, in the faint limp from a wound that never fully healed, and in eyes that still, in unguarded moments, darted to corners as if expecting danger. Those eyes had seen things no cadet could imagine. War zones where every shadow held a threat, where every decision carried life or death stakes. Years ago, in a desert far from Westbridge's manicured lawns, Harold led a joint strike force on a mission called Iron Echo. It was a desperate bid to rescue 30 captured soldiers trapped deep in enemy territory. The intelligence was shoddy, the extraction plan collapsed, and the odds were grim. Harold's heart pounded as he navigated his team through hostile terrain, his mind racing to outthink the enemy. He felt the weight of every soldier's life, the terror of failing them. They made it back, but not all of them. The northern valley outside Fallujah haunted him still, a place of blood and loss he never spoke of, but carried in every step. When a door slammed too hard in the mess hall, or a cadet's shout echoed too sharply, his body tensed, not from weakness, but from memories that refused to fade. Forgetting would mean betraying those who didn't come home, and that was a line Harold would never cross. His team had called him Ghost, a nod to his silent movements through battlefields and the uncanny way he survived what should have killed him. The name stuck, a quiet tribute to a man who'd faced death and walked away, but not unchanged. After retirement, the Pentagon tried to pull him back with a consulting role, promising a desk, a title, respect. Harold's chest tightened at the thought. He didn't want another round of politics dressed up as patriotism, nor did he need a plaque to validate his worth. He longed for something quieter, a way to stay close to the military's pulse without drowning in its noise. Westbridge was his refuge, a place where no one knew his name or his scars. In choosing to sweep its floors, he wasn't hiding. He was teaching, in his own way, what service truly meant. Not the polished pomp of parades, but the relentless, unglamorous work of showing up, day after day, for something bigger than yourself. Every swipe of his mop was a quiet act of defiance against a world that valued flash over substance. The irony cut deep. Heroes like Harold didn't seek the spotlight, yet the world let them slip into obscurity. They traded combat boots for work shoes, command posts for bus stops, and stood in silence as the country they'd sacrificed for rushed past. Harold's medals gathered dust in a shoebox, his commendations faded in a drawer. Not because he dismissed them, but because he didn't need them to define him. He felt their weight every morning when he rose, every evening when he lay down. If anyone had taken a moment to truly see him, to look beyond the frayed uniform and the broom, they might have glimpsed a man who'd once held the lives of others in his hands, who'd stared down chaos and carried the grief of loss. They might have seen a soldier who chose humility over pride, who served not for applause but because it was who he was. But no one looked. No one asked. To the cadets, he was just the janitor, and that dismissal was a silence louder than their taunts. The symposium descended on Westbridge like a storm the cadets had braced for all semester. The Grand Assembly Hall gleamed, its floors polished by Harold's hands until they reflected the crisp flags overhead. The air hummed with nervous energy as cadets adjusted their uniforms, their usual bravado muted by the gravity of the event. They didn't know it yet, but the man they'd mocked was about to step into a light that would leave them stunned, their careless words a shadow they couldn't escape. The Grand Assembly Hall gleamed with an almost sacred stillness, its towering brass candelabras standing like sentinels, their candles unwavering in their polished holders. Row by row, cadets marched in with a precision that seemed to slice through the heavy quiet. Their uniforms were immaculate, creased to perfection, as if each fold had been measured with a ruler. Medals and pins caught the soft glow of the chandeliers overhead, winking like stars against the deep navy fabric. Collars sat flush against necks, not a thread out of place, and every boot shone with a mirror-like polish that reflected the weight of expectation. Hair was parted with mathematical accuracy, each strand disciplined into submission. This was no ordinary day at the academy. It was the day, the annual ceremony that drew every eye, every ambition, every whispered hope for recognition, a chance to stand taller, to be seen by those who could shape a career, to etch one's name into the institution's storied legacy. Yet beneath the polished surface, a current of unease rippled through the room. Cadets, despite their flawless exteriors, betrayed their nerves in subtle ways. A quick tug at a sash, a fleeting glance at a neighbor's posture, a shallow breath held too long. Their hearts raced with the pressure to perform, to embody the ideals drilled into them since their first day. Instructors prowled the sidelines, their eyes hawk-like, clutching checklists and murmuring into radios, their clipped tones barely audible but laden with authority. They were the architects of this moment, and nothing, not a single misstep, could be allowed to tarnish it. The air was thick with anticipation, but also with something heavier, something unspoken that seemed to coil tighter with every passing second. This year, the keynote speaker was no mere dignitary, no politician or retired officer coasting on past glories. It was General Thomas Reeve, a four-star legend whose name carried the weight of history itself. He wasn't just mentioned in textbooks, he was the living embodiment of them. His career spanned 4 continents, each ribbon on his chest a testament to battles fought and won. He had survived the brutal siege of Corva, a campaign that had broken lesser men, and his counterinsurgency tactics were still dissected in classrooms, revered as doctrine. He had mentored generals who now shaped the military's future, a lineage of leadership that traced back to him. To the cadets, he was more myth than man, a figure so larger than life that his presence alone felt like a test they hadn't studied for. When the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open, a hush descended like a velvet curtain, smothering even the faintest rustle of fabric. General Reeve stepped into the room and time itself seemed to pause. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his frame carrying the quiet strength of a mountain. His face was weathered but composed, his eyes sharp and unyielding, like a glacier carving its path through stone. His uniform was pristine, the rows of ribbons and medals gleaming with stories of courage, sacrifice, and triumph. His boots didn't pound the floor. They moved with a measured grace, each step a whisper of absolute authority. The room surged to its feet as one, a wave of salutes snapping into place with the precision of a firing squad. It was a gesture born of tradition, of reverence, of a legacy that bound every soul in that hall to something greater than themselves. But then something extraordinary happened. Something no one could have foreseen, not the cadets, not the instructors, not even the commanders seated in their places of honor. General Reeve didn't stride toward the podium, where a polished microphone and a carefully folded speech awaited him. He didn't acknowledge the dignitaries in the front row, their faces expectant, their hands poised to shake his. He didn't pause to salute the flags flanking the stage or nod to the senior officers who had risen to greet him. Instead, he kept walking, his steps deliberate, his gaze fixed on a point no one else had noticed. Past the stage, past the rows of cadets standing rigid with awe, past the gleaming symbols of military pride, he moved toward the back of the hall, toward a shadowed corner, toward a man no one had ever thought to see. Harold Kaine was there, as he always was, sweeping the floor with the same quiet diligence he'd brought to the task for decades. His gray coveralls hung loosely on his thin frame, his hands calloused from years of labor. To the cadets, he was invisible, a fixture as unremarkable as the brass candelabras or the polished floors. They had nicknamed him Colonel Broomstick, a cruel jab tossed behind his back, a way to dismiss the old janitor who seemed to exist only to clean up after them. But now, as General Reeve approached, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. Cadets shifted in their seats, their confusion palpable. Instructors exchanged bewildered glances, their radios forgotten. Even the brass on stage leaned forward, their brows furrowed, uncertain what they were witnessing. Only Reeve moved that with purpose, his eyes locked on Harold, his stride unbroken. Time seemed to slow, the air growing thick with a tension that bordered on sacred. When Reeve stopped just a few feet from Harold, the hall held its breath. The old man had paused his sweeping, sensing the shift in the room though he hadn't yet looked up. His hands gripped the broom handle, knuckles pale as if bracing for something he couldn't name. Then Reeve straightened, his posture impeccable, and raised his hand in a salute, not a casual gesture, not a polite nod, but a full, formal military salute, crisp and unwavering. The sound of a cadet's gasp pierced the silence. Another dropped his pen, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. The room wasn't just stunned, it was transformed, the silence now heavy with reverence, with a dawning realization that something profound was unfolding. Reeve's voice, when he spoke, was steady but resonant, carrying just far enough to reach every ear in the hall. "Sir," he said, "it's an honor to finally meet you in person." "Sir." The word landed like a thunderclap, shattering every assumption, every snide remark, every careless slight the cadets had ever directed at Harold Kaine. It wasn't janitor, not Mr., but sir, a title of respect, of recognition, of something deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. Harold, for the first time in years, lifted his head fully, his eyes meeting Reeve's. There was a moment of stillness, a flicker of something raw and unguarded in the old man's face. Surprise, yes, but also a quiet dignity that had been buried beneath years of invisibility. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he raised his hand and returned the salute, his fingers trembling, but his gaze steady. The silence in the hall had become something sacred, a shared breath held in the presence of a truth no one had seen coming. The cadets who had once laughed at Harold, who had seen him as little more than a shadow in their periphery, now stared at him with wide eyes, as if a ghost had stepped out of the walls and claimed its place among them. Their minds raced with questions, with guilt, with a sudden awareness of their own smallness. The instructors stood frozen, their checklists irrelevant, their authority dwarfed by the weight of this moment. The commanders on stage exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of awe and unease, as if they too had missed something vital all along. The air in the assembly hall had changed irrevocably. It no longer hummed with the restless ambition of cadets or the stiff formalities of tradition. It was charged with something deeper, something unspoken yet immense, hanging on the edge of revelation. Harold Kaine, the man they had overlooked, the man they had mocked, stood at the center of it all, his quiet presence now a beacon that demanded to be seen. And as General Chief lowered his salute, his eyes still locked on Harold's, the lesson, the true lesson of the day, was only just beginning to unfold. In the grand hall of Westbridge Academy, General Thomas Reeve stood tall, his arm raised in a crisp, unwavering salute. His gesture wasn't directed at a fellow officer or a decorated hero in dress blues, but at a man in a simple gray uniform, the janitor, Colonel Harold Kaine. The general's posture radiated respect, his eyes locked on Harold with an intensity that seemed to pull the very air from the room. Harold returned the salute with a slow, deliberate precision, each movement steeped in a quiet dignity that felt almost sacred. It was as if the stone walls of the academy, etched with decades of military tradition, stirred awake, whispering memories of honor long forgotten. General Reeve turned to face the sea of cadets, their faces a mosaic of anticipation and confusion. His voice, steady yet resonant, filled the hall like a low rumble of thunder before a storm. It was the kind of voice that had once barked orders across chaotic battlefields, compelling soldiers to act on instinct alone. "Before I deliver my remarks," he began, his words measured but heavy with purpose, "there's a man in this room who deserves far more than any praise I could ever hope to receive." The cadets, frozen in their impeccable posture, shifted their gazes toward the corridor where Harold stood, unassuming in his workman's attire. A ripple of curiosity stirred among them. This man, in who they'd seen countless times pushing a broom or wiping down tables, was now the focal point of a general's reverence. This man, Reeve continued, his voice softening but no less commanding, led soldiers into the jaws of death while most of you were still mastering the art of tying your shoelaces. He doesn't have a building named after him, no gleaming plaque to mark his deeds. But if there were any justice in this world, his name would be carved into the very foundations of this academy. A murmur broke out in the back rows, soft but electric. One cadet, barely audible, whispered to his neighbor, "Who is he?" Another, clutching a notepad, sat stunned, his pen hovering uselessly above the page, his mind racing to reconcile the image of the quiet janitor with the weight of the general's words. Reeves' eyes swept the room as if daring anyone to miss the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "You know him as the janitor," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "But I knew him as my commanding officer, the man who saved my life and the lives of 212 others during Operation Iron Echo." The name hit the room like a shockwave. Gasps erupted, sharp and uneven, like stones tossed into still water. Operation Iron Echo was the stuff of whispered legend, a mission shrouded in secrecy and dread. Cadets had heard fragments of it in late-night study sessions. Rumors of a doomed extraction, terrain that turned against the soldiers, intelligence leaks that left them exposed to a merciless enemy. It was said to be a suicide mission, the kind where survival was a miracle, not a plan. And yet, someone had defied the odds, leading a battered team through the crucible to safety. Until this moment, that someone had been a faceless myth, a ghost in the annals of military lore. Now he stood before them, unassuming, his weathered hands folded calmly at his sides. General Reeves' gaze softened as he looked at Harold, a nod of acknowledgement passing between them. "Colonel Harold Kaine isn't in your history books," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet reverence. "Most of his record remains classified, locked away in vaults where heroes like him are too often forgotten. He didn't come to Westbridge for glory or recognition. He came because he believes that duty doesn't end when the world stops singing your name." The words landed heavily on the cadets, stirring a storm of emotions. For many, memories of their own casual cruelty came rushing back, jokes tossed carelessly in the hallways, sneers aimed at the old janitor, who seemed so out of place among their polished ranks. Mason Trill, a cadet known for his brash voice and quick wit, sat rigid in his seat, his face drained of color. His jaw clenched as shame burned through him, each remembered taunt now a weight pressing on his chest. He'd been the loudest, the one who'd mocked Harold's quiet demeanor, his simple uniform. Now, those moments felt like betrayals, each one a stain on the honor he'd sworn to uphold. Reeves' eyes lingered on Harold, and for a moment the general's stoic facade cracked, revealing a depth of gratitude that bordered on awe. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've waited more than 20 years to say this to your face. You didn't just save lives that day. You showed us what leadership truly means, what it looks like to stand firm when the world is falling apart around you." The room held its breath, waiting for Harold to respond, to bask in the moment. But Harold didn't swell with pride or seek the spotlight. He offered only the slightest nod, his expression calm, almost resigned, as if he'd always known this day might come. Not because he craved it, but because truth, like water, finds a way to rise. The absence of applause wasn't due to disrespect. The cadets were simply too stunned, too humbled to break the silence. Their perfectly pressed uniforms, their rehearsed salutes, their polished boots, all of it felt trivial now, overshadowed by the quiet man in gray who embodied the honor they aspired to. The silence stretched, not out of formality, but out of a collective reverence that seemed to hum in the air, mingling with the faint buzz of the overhead lights. General Reeve turned to Harold once more, his voice softening to a near whisper. "Colonel Kaine, would you say a few words?" Harold hesitated, his eyes sweeping across the hall. Hundreds of cadets stared back, their polished buttons gleaming under the lights, their faces a mix of awe, guilt, and curiosity. He glanced at the instructors lining the walls, their own expressions mirroring the cadets' shock. Behind them, plaques gleamed with the names of past heroes, and the Academy's flag stirred gently, as if nudged by the weight of the moment. For a fleeting second, Harold's gaze lingered on the flag, and a flicker of memory crossed his face. Perhaps a battlefield, a scream, a moment when duty had demanded everything. Then, with a quiet resolve, he stepped forward, ready to speak, his presence alone, a testament to a legacy that no shadow could dim. In the dim light of the auditorium, Harold Kaine, weathered by time and experience, shuffled toward the center of the stage. His old boots, scuffed in gray, whispered against the polished floor, each step deliberate as though carrying the weight of decades. He didn't claim the podium, didn't reach for a microphone. Instead, he stood, his faded uniform hanging loosely on his frame, and began to speak. His voice, low and steady, held a quiet power that seemed to still the air itself, commanding attention without effort. "I'm not here for honors," he said, his words slicing through the room like a blade tempered by years of hard-earned truth. "I'm here for the men who never made it home." The weight of those words settled over the audience, heavy and unyielding. The cadets, young and crisp in their starched uniforms, stirred in their seats. Some averted their gazes, their eyes tracing the floor as if it might hold answers to the sudden discomfort twisting in their chests. Others leaned forward, drawn to the raw sincerity in Harold's voice, their hearts quickening with a mix of awe and unease. Harold's weathered face, lined with the scars of battles both seen and unseen, remained steady as he continued. "Leadership isn't about barking orders or strutting in perfect formation. It's about carrying the burden when no one's looking. It's about staring into the jaws of chaos and choosing to stand tall, even when those you're sworn to protect look to you with terror in their eyes." His words hung in the air, each one a quiet challenge to the cadets' untested ideals. He paused, letting the silence amplify his message, his gaze sweeping across the sea of youthful faces before him. Inside, Harold felt the familiar ache of memory. Every word he spoke stirred ghosts, comrades whose laughter once filled smoky barracks, whose courage had burned brighter than any metal. He saw their faces now, flickering in his mind's eye, and his heart clenched with a grief that had never dulled. Yet he pressed on, driven by a duty to make these young souls understand. "You wear these uniforms with pride, and that's right," he said, his voice softening but no less firm. "But know this, rank doesn't make you worthy. Your actions do. Your sacrifices do. Your humility does." His eyes moved slowly across the room, lingering on each cadet. They were so young, their faces still untouched by the harsh realities of war, their hearts still believing in their own invincibility. Harold's chest tightened with a mix of hope and sorrow. He wanted to shield them from the pain he knew awaited, yet he knew they needed to hear the truth. "In my unit," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we live by a code. No one ate until every man was safe. No one slept until the perimeter was secure. That wasn't in any rule book. It came from respect. For each other, for the lives we held in our hands." His voice wavered just for a moment as he spoke of the men he'd lost. "I buried good men because of that code," he said, his throat tightening. "Men whose names you'll never find in history books, whose stories died with them. They weren't flawless, but they were brave. Their silence, their absence paved the way for you to sit here today." The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thick with the weight of his words. A cadet near the front blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening as she fought back tears. Another swallowed hard, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest of his chair. Harold's gaze drifted to the floor, his thoughts turning inward. "When I sweep these halls," he said, his voice steady once more, "I'm not just pushing a broom. I'm walking through memories. I'm honoring the ghosts of men whose voices are gone forever." He spoke with a quiet reverence, as though the act of cleaning was a sacred ritual, a way to keep those lost souls alive in his heart. The cadets sat motionless, their earlier restlessness replaced by a profound stillness. They could feel the depth of his loss, the unspoken pain woven into every word. Then came the words that would linger in their minds long after the ceremony ended. "If you want to lead, truly lead, you must learn to see the invisible, not just those above you, but those below, beside, and behind. The greatest leaders never forget a single soul." Harold's voice was firm, his conviction unshakable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture for emphasis. He didn't need to. His words carried their own power, rooted in a lifetime of hard lessons and unyielding integrity. He stepped back, his hands clasped behind him, his head bowed in a gesture of quiet dignity. No grand finale, no plea for applause, just Harold, Standing alone with the weight of his truth, the room remained silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, demanding reflection. It wasn't the hollow quiet of boredom, but a reverence that made each cadet acutely aware of the space they occupied and the legacy of those who had come before. Then a single sound pierced the stillness, a chair creaking in the middle row. Cadet Mason Trill rose slowly, his face pale, his jaw tight as though struggling to contain a torrent of emotions he didn't yet know how to name. Once brimming with cocky pride, his expression now held something raw, something vulnerable. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of shame and awe swirling within him. He'd mocked Harold before, dismissed him as just a janitor, but now he saw the man for who he truly was, a living testament to sacrifice and honor. All eyes turned to Mason, but his gaze was fixed on Harold. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing the floor, and swallowed hard. "Sir," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, yet they poured out of him, heavy with sincerity. "For everything, for the jokes, the disrespect. I didn't know. That's no excuse, but I'm sorry." His chest ached with regret, his mind replaying every careless word he'd spoken, every smirk he'd aimed at the man who now stood before him, radiating quiet strength. Harold didn't respond with a lecture or a grand gesture. He simply gave Mason a small nod, a subtle acknowledgement that carried the weight of forgiveness. It was enough. Mason's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes still shimmered with unshed tears. He felt a shift within himself, a crack in the armor of his arrogance, letting in the first glimmers of humility. Then something extraordinary happened. Another cadet stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. Then another, and another, until every cadet in the room was on their feet. It wasn't a coordinated act, but a spontaneous wave of respect. Each young soul moved by Harold's words and Mason's courage. Their hearts beat with a shared realization. They were part of something bigger, something that demanded more of them than they had ever imagined. Harold stood motionless, his eyes lifting to take in the sea of standing cadets. His heart swelled with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the potential he saw in them. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The room held its breath, the silence a final tribute to the man who had spoken not for glory, but of duty, loss, and the invisible threads that bind us all. In the hallowed halls of Westbridge Military Academy, where discipline and tradition wove the very fabric of existence, a profound moment unfolded. Not born of obligation, but of a deep, unspoken necessity. One by one, the cadets raised their hands in salute, their movements deliberate, devoid of pomp or ritual. No words pierced the silence, only the weight of mutual understanding. Some faces bore the flush of shame, their eyes averted as memories of past indifference surfaced. Others glowed with inspiration, their chests swelling with newfound reverence. A few fought back tears, their throats tightening against the tide of emotion threatening to spill over. Yet every single one stood resolute, shoulders squared, spines rigid, not for a commanding officer, not for the sake of protocol, but for a man they had once dismissed, a man named Harold Kaine. General Reeves, a figure of authority whose presence often dominated any room, stood quietly to the side. His silence was intentional, his posture relaxed yet purposeful as he stepped back, ceding the stage. With the wisdom of a seasoned leader, he recognized this was not his moment to shine. He understood, as only those tempered by time and trials do, when to guide and when to let others grapple with the raw truth. This moment belonged to Harold, and Harold alone. The academy, steeped in its codes of honor, its meticulous drills, and its rigid formalities, was suddenly stripped bare, reminded of something far purer than tradition. Respect, they learned, cannot be demanded by rank or title. It must be earned through actions, through sacrifice, through the quiet persistence of a life well lived. And once earned, it compels acknowledgement, even from those who once turned a blind eye. Harold stood at the center of this unspoken revolution, his weathered frame almost buckling under the sea of salutes washing over him. His heart raced, not with pride, but with a quiet, overwhelming humility. He felt the weight of every gaze, every gesture, and it stirred something deep within, a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Yet he refused to let his emotions betray him. No tears fell from his eyes, no smile curved his lips. Instead, he offered a slight bow of his head, a gesture not for himself but for the brothers he had lost in the crucible of war. Those men whose laughter once echoed in his ears, whose dreams were snuffed out too soon, were the true architects of this moment. They were the ones whose sacrifices had laid every brick of this academy, whose absence haunted Harold's every step. The cadets would never see their faces, never know their names, but their legacy pulsed through the silence, binding the room together. In those fleeting minutes, something sacred transpired. Redemption hung in the air, not as a gift Harold sought, but as a truth that could no longer be ignored. Respect was restored, not through Harold's pleas or demands, but because the cadets had seen him, truly seen him, for the first time. The quiet hall, filled with young men and women on the cusp of their own journeys, became a crucible where history was rewritten, not with ink or grand proclamations, but through the simple, powerful act of recognition. As the final salute fell, Harold Kaine turned, his movements unhurried, unassuming. There was no flourish, no lingering for applause or handshakes, no parting words to cement his legacy. Just the soft, rhythmic creak of his broom cart's rubber wheels rolling across the polished marble floor. He moved with the same steady pace, the same unbowed posture, as if the past quarter hour hadn't upended the very soul of the academy, as if he hadn't just redefined what respect meant in that sacred space. No cameras trailed him, no officers flanked his side, no one rushed to offer praise. He didn't pause to seek validation. He didn't need it. He slipped around the corner, fading into the shadows like a specter returning to its realm. But the air had shifted. This time, every eye followed his departure, lingering on the space where he'd stood. Every cadet stood a fraction taller, their chests rising not out of duty, but out of understanding. For the first time, they didn't see a janitor shuffling away with his cart. They saw a man who had borne the cost of command, who had carried the weight of silence through decades of anonymity, who had chosen humility over glory. Harold's quiet exit spoke louder than any speech could have. In a world consumed by titles, by status, by the clamor for recognition, he showed that true greatness moves softly, with a bowed head and calloused hands. He left not with fanfare, but with a silence he had earned, a silence that demanded reverence, not because of a rank, but because of a life shaped by sacrifice, unseen and uncelebrated, yet unyielding. Across generations, there are those who serve without craving the spotlight, who return from the horrors of war only to blend into the tapestry of ordinary life. They take jobs no one notices, tread paths no one honors, and carry burdens no one sees. They hold not just memories, but the ache of loss, the weight of principles, and the names of comrades who never came home. Harold Kaine was one such soul, his heart a quiet repository of pain and purpose. That day, the cadets of Westbridge Military Academy didn't merely learn about him. They felt the truth of his existence, and it changed them forever. The cadets stood in the assembly hall, their eyes fixed on the man before them. As he spoke, they began to grasp the essence of his character. It wasn't just about the words he chose or the way he stood tall despite the years etched into his face. It was about honor, a kind that didn't demand a spotlight or a crowd to validate it. This was a man who led with a quiet strength, never seeking the glow of admiration or the clamor of praise. His legacy, they realized, wasn't one that needed grand monuments or inscriptions in stone to endure. It lived in the lives he touched, in the way he moved through the world with purpose and integrity. As the heavy wooden doors of the hall creaked shut behind him, the room fell into a reverent silence. Most of the cadets began to disperse, their boots echoing softly on the polished floor, but one young man remained at attention. His heart pounded with a mix of awe and introspection. He whispered almost to himself, his voice barely breaking the stillness. That was the real commander. The words carried a weight he hadn't expected, as if speaking them aloud made the truth more tangible. He thought about the commander's presence, not defined by the stars pinned to his shoulders or the medals glinting on his chest, but by something deeper. It was in the way he carried himself when he thought no one was watching, in the respect he showed to those who bore the heaviest burdens of sacrifice. The cadet's mind raced, wondering if he could ever live up to such a standard, if he could learn to lead with that kind of selfless grace. The commander, Harold Kaine, had left an impression that lingered like a quiet melody. To the cadets, he was a living reminder that true respect isn't tied to titles or accolades. It's rooted in character, the kind forged in moments of solitude, in choices made when no one else is there to applaud. Leadership, they learned from him, isn't about how loudly you proclaim your authority, but how deeply you commit to serving others. Harold's life was a testament to this truth, and it stirred something in the cadets' hearts, a longing to emulate his example, to carry forward his unspoken lessons. In that moment, the cadets weren't just thinking about Harold as an individual. They were reflecting on a broader truth, one that felt almost radical in the context of modern America. In a world obsessed with status, where worth is often measured by wealth, fame, or the number of followers on a screen, Harold's story was a challenge. It urged them to pause, to look beyond the surface, to reconsider who they might be overlooking in their own lives. The janitor sweeping the halls with a steady hand, the veteran living alone in a modest apartment, the neighbor with eyes that held stories of unspoken pain. Each of them carried a quiet dignity that deserved recognition. The cadets felt a pang of guilt, wondering how many such heroes they'd pass by without a second glance. Harold's story wasn't just a lesson, it was a call to action. It reminded them that some of the most profound teachers in life never raise their voices or demand attention. They don't wear medals or chase applause. Instead, they show up day after day, doing the hard work that others might shy away from. They carry the weight of their sacrifices with a grace that speaks louder than any speech. Harold Kaine was one such teacher, and his life challenged the cadets to rethink what it means to lead, to serve, to live with purpose. As the cadet who had whispered those words finally stepped out of the hall, his mind was alight with questions. Who else in his life might be carrying a story like Harold's? He thought of his own grandfather, a man of few words who had served in a war decades ago and now spent his days tending a small garden. He thought of the barista at the coffee shop near the academy, whose tired smile hinted at struggles he'd never know. Each of them, he realized, might hold lessons he'd been too busy to notice. The cadet resolved to pay closer attention, to seek out the quiet heroes who walked among them. Harold's story also sparked a broader reflection among the cadets about the world they lived in. They thought about how easy it was to get caught up in the rush of modern life, where success is often defined by what's visible: likes, shares, titles, wealth. But Harold's life stood as a counterpoint, a reminder that true worth lies in the unseen moments, in the choices made when no one is watching. They felt a mix of inspiration and unease, wondering if they could rise to the challenge of living with such integrity. The cadets left the assembly hall with a renewed sense of purpose. They wanted to honor Harold's legacy, not just by remembering him, but by seeking out others like him, those who lived with quiet courage, who served without expectation of reward. They wanted to share these stories to ensure that no veteran, no unsung hero was ever forgotten. They imagined a world where people slowed down long enough to notice the dignity in those around them, to recognize the strength in those who carried their burdens silently. Harold Kaine's story was a beacon, guiding them toward a deeper understanding of what it means to live with honor. It wasn't about the medals or the titles, but about the heart behind them. It was about showing up, serving deeply, and leaving a legacy that didn't need to be shouted to be remembered. As the cadets walked into the crisp evening air, they carried his lessons with them, determined to see the world and the people in it a little differently.